The sun was dipping low in the Arizona sky, painting the land in a warm orange glow. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Jack Thompson rode his chestnut-colored horse slowly along a narrow trail that cut through the quiet desert. He wasn't in a hurry. The land was wide and endless, and for a man like him, there was no real rush to be anywhere. He wore a wide hat that shaded his face, and a light scarf around his neck to keep the sand out. Jack wasn't rich, but he carried with him something better than gold, a kind heart and a steady spirit. As he rode toward a small settlement, he noticed how silent the world around him was. Only the sound of the horses' hooves broke the stillness. The sky stretched far and wide, and the setting sun made everything glow. Jack had spent most of his life traveling from one place to another, working odd jobs on ranches and helping where he could. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man who noticed things. And that evening he noticed something unusual. Near a crumbling stone well, a small figure was standing very still. Jack slowed down, squinting his eyes against the bright light. It was a young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her black hair was long and shiny, tied back with a simple strip of cloth. Her clothes were plain, showing signs of wear. She was barefoot, and her small hands were folded tightly in front of her. But what caught Jack's attention most were her eyes. They were wide, dark, and filled with something he understood immediately: hunger. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She just stood there looking at him as if she wasn't sure whether to stay or run. Jack gently pulled the reins, bringing his horse to a stop. He didn't want to scare her. Slowly he dismounted, keeping his movements calm and quiet. He took off his hat and held it loosely in his hands. "Hey there," he said softly, almost like talking to a bird that might fly away if he was too loud. The girl didn't answer. She took one small step backward but didn't run. Jack could see she was thin, her cheeks slightly hollow. He knew that kind of hunger. He had felt it himself when times were hard. Jack reached into the small leather bag tied to his saddle and took out a piece of cornbread he had saved from lunch. It wasn't much, just a square piece wrapped in cloth, but it smelled warm and sweet. He also took out a strip of beef jerky and his canteen of water. He placed everything carefully on a flat rock a few steps away from her. "You can have this," he said gently. "I've got more." The girl didn't move at first. Her big eyes darted from the food to Jack's face, as if trying to figure out if it was a trick. Jack took a few steps back, showing her that he wasn't going to force anything. After a long pause, she walked slowly to the rock, her small feet kicking up a bit of dust. She picked up the cornbread carefully, like it was something precious, and held it close to her nose. The smell alone seemed to bring a tiny spark of light to her face. She took a small bite, then another. Soon she was eating as if she hadn't tasted food in a long time. Jack didn't say anything. He just watched quietly. When she finished the cornbread, she picked up the jerky, chewing it slowly. She took small sips of water from the canteen, careful not to waste a single drop. Jack noticed how polite she was. She didn't grab or gulp. She respected every bit of it. Then from behind a cluster of rocks, another figure appeared. A tall woman with long black hair braided down her back. She wore a simple dress and a light shawl around her shoulders. Her face was calm but strong, like someone who had seen many hard days but never lost her pride. This was Nayeli, an Apache woman and the little girl's mother. She walked toward them with steady steps. Jack didn't move. He could see the bond between the mother and daughter in the way the girl ran to her side, holding her hand tightly. Nayeli looked at Jack for a long moment. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. Her eyes were deep, like a river that carried old stories. Jack tipped his hat politely. "Evening, ma'am," he said softly. Still, she didn't speak. Instead, she looked at the empty cloth that once held the food. Then she looked at Jack again, her gaze calm but firm. Something unspoken passed between them. Jack didn't fully understand it, but he could feel it. In her culture, in her people's ways, this was not just an act of kindness. Feeding a child wasn't something small. It was something sacred. In their traditions, when a person gave food to a child, it was as if they were welcoming that child, and by extension, the family, into their life. It created a bond that was deeper than a handshake or a promise. Jack didn't know these traditions, but he knew enough to sense that what he had done mattered. The wind picked up a little, carrying the sound of the dry grass brushing against the earth. The sky was turning darker now, with the first stars appearing above. Nayeli and her daughter stood together, their silhouettes outlined against the fading light. Jack stood opposite them, feeling something shift in the quiet space between them. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "You gave food to my daughter," she said in accented but clear English. Jack nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She looked hungry. Naomi didn't say thank you. Instead, she said something that puzzled him. "This means something." He tilted his head slightly, not sure what she meant. But he didn't want to be disrespectful, so he just listened. Naomi stepped closer, not threatening, just sure of herself. She placed her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. "In my people's way," she continued, "when you feed a child, you join with the family. It is not just food. It is trust. It is respect. It is connection." Jack opened his mouth to say something but closed it again. He wasn't sure what words could match the weight of what she was saying. He had only wanted to help. He had no idea that a simple piece of cornbread could carry such deep meaning. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes softer now, not just hungry but grateful. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Jack understood. As the last light of day disappeared, Naomi gestured toward the small settlement in the distance. It wasn't big, just a few simple homes made from wood and adobe. She didn't invite him with words. She just gave a small nod, the kind that said, "You are welcome here now." Jack followed them at a respectful distance. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but something inside him felt it was the right thing to do. When they reached the small fire outside Naomi's home, a few other people looked up. They didn't seem surprised. In their eyes, the fact that he had fed the child already said everything they needed to know. He wasn't a stranger anymore, not entirely. Jack sat on a log near the fire, still quiet. Naomi and her daughter sat nearby, wrapped in a light blanket. The stars overhead grew brighter and the night air cooled. Someone offered him a cup of warm herbal tea and he accepted it with a grateful nod. All around there was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes from people who know how to live close to the land. Jack listened to the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of crickets. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he felt a calm he hadn't felt in years. The little girl leaned against her mother, already half asleep. Naomi kept her gaze on the fire, but every now and then glanced at Jack, not suspiciously but curiously, as if trying to see the kind of man he really was. Jack wasn't sure what to say, so he said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, as the stars covered the desert sky, a bond had quietly formed. It wasn't made with loud promises or grand gestures. It was made with a small piece of cornbread, a kind heart, and an old tradition carried through generations. In that moment, none of them fully understood how this bond would shape their lives. But the desert had a way of turning small moments into powerful stories. And this was only the beginning of theirs. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting soft golden light on the land. Jack Thompson woke up early, just as the first rays touched the tops of the cactus and brush. The small Apache settlement was quiet. A thin line of smoke rose from a few cooking fires, and the air smelled faintly of corn, beans, and earth. Jack rubbed his eyes, still trying to understand the strange feeling inside him. He had arrived here a stranger the day before, but something had changed. Naomi stood a few steps away, tending to the fire outside her home. Her daughter was sitting beside her, holding a wooden cup of warm drink. When the girl saw Jack, she smiled shyly. It was a small smile, but it carried more warmth than the sun itself. Jack smiled back and lifted his hand in greeting. Naomi looked up at him and nodded. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in her expression, something steady, as if she had already made a decision. She gestured for him to sit by the fire. Jack walked slowly and lowered himself onto a wooden log. He felt a little awkward, but also strangely at ease. They sat quietly for a few minutes. Jack wasn't used to so much silence. Most places he had been to were filled with noise and talk. But here, silence wasn't empty. It was full. The sound of the wind moving across the sand, the gentle crackle of the fire, the soft humming of birds. It all felt like part of something bigger. Finally, Naomi spoke in her clear, soft voice. "You gave food to my daughter." Jack nodded slowly. Yes, she was hungry. "I just wanted to help." Naomi looked at him, her dark eyes steady. "In my people's way," she said, "that means something. It is not a small thing. When a person feeds a child, it is a bond, a promise, a connection between families." Jack listened carefully. He still didn't fully understand, but he respected her words. He had traveled enough to know that the world was full of different ways of living and believing. And sometimes the smallest gesture meant more than 100 words. Nayeli stood up and faced him fully now. She spoke with quiet strength. "You fed my daughter. By ancestral tradition, I belong to you now." The words hung in the air like the morning mist. Jack blinked, unsure if he had heard right. He wasn't expecting anything like that. He had shared a piece of cornbread, not asked for someone's hand or life. I don't understand," he said gently, not wanting to offend. "I didn't do it for anything. I just couldn't leave her hungry." Nayeli nodded slowly. "I know, but my people do not forget kindness. Long ago, our elders made traditions to protect the heart. When someone gives food to a child, it means that person is now part of the child's family. It is not about taking. It is about belonging. About trust." Jack felt something shift inside him. He thought about all the places he had been, towns where people barely knew their neighbors, where kindness was rare. But here a small act carried meaning strong enough to tie lives together. Nayeli continued softly. "This bond is not a chain. It does not take away freedom. It builds a bridge." Jack finally understood. She wasn't saying she was his in the way people might think. She was saying that their lives were now connected by something ancient and respected. The little girl came closer to Jack and gently placed a small carved stone in his hand. It was smooth, shaped like a river stone but with tiny symbols etched onto it. Jack looked at it carefully. Nayeli explained, "This is a sign of trust. It means you are part of us now." Jack held the stone tightly. He wasn't sure if he deserved such trust, but he felt honored by it. Over the next few days, Jack stayed in the settlement, helping where he could. He carried water from the well, helped repair a fence, and even shared a few tricks he had learned from working on ranches. He didn't speak much, but the people saw his honesty in his actions. Slowly, they began to greet him with nods, and some even smiled when they saw him pass by. The children liked him the most. They followed him around, curious about his hat, his horse, and the way he could whistle to make a bird answer. Jack told them small, simple stories about the places he had seen. He didn't use fancy words, just real stories about rivers, forests, and sunsets. The children laughed and clapped. Their laughter filled the air like a song. Nayeli often watched quietly. She had always been careful with strangers. But this cowboy was different. He wasn't loud. He didn't try to show off. He just fit into their world slowly, like a seed growing in good soil. One afternoon, as the sun glowed high in the sky, Nayeli sat near the fire while Jack fixed a broken water bucket. She spoke softly, almost like talking to the wind. "Long ago, our people believed that some meetings were chosen by the ancestors. They believed the land brings certain souls together for a reason." Jack paused and looked at her. "Do you think that's what this is?" She nodded gently. "Yes, you gave food to my daughter. But maybe it was not only food. Maybe it was the beginning of something written long before we met." Jack didn't have an answer. He just smiled faintly. He wasn't a man of deep words, but he felt something true in what she said. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire with the others. Nayeli would sing soft songs in her language, songs of rivers, mountains, and stars. Jack didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. The songs spoke of love, courage, and belonging. As the days passed, he began to feel less like a traveler and more like someone who had found a place to breathe. He didn't know how long he would stay, but he knew this place had given him something no other place ever had: connection. One night, as the stars filled the sky like diamonds, Nayeli sat next to Jack. The little girl was asleep in her mother's arms. The fire crackled softly. Jack turned to her and said quietly, "I've been on the road a long time. Never thought I'd belong anywhere, but here, it feels different." Nayeli looked at him with calm eyes. "Because this is not just land, it is home. And once the land accepts someone, they are never truly alone again." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next morning, the little girl ran up to him with a handmade bracelet made of woven grass and tiny colored beads. She slipped it onto his wrist with a proud smile. Jack laughed softly and tapped his hat in thanks. In their world, these gestures were more powerful than long speeches. They didn't need to say, "Your family." They showed it with kindness, trust, and quiet care. Weeks later, travelers passing through would sometimes see the cowboy riding alongside Nayeli and her daughter, carrying supplies, helping build fences, or simply walking through the desert together. People whispered stories about how a small act of kindness had bound two worlds, one man from the outside and one woman rooted in the land. The story wasn't about ownership. It was about respect, about two paths crossing in a way neither had expected. Jack never tried to change their ways. He learned them. And Nayeli never asked him to be someone else. She simply accepted that his kindness had tied their lives together. Years later, the elders of the settlement would still talk about that evening when a hungry child met a kind cowboy. They said the ancestors smiled that day because an old tradition had been honored again. And somewhere in the wide Arizona desert, Jack learned that real belonging isn't something you buy or take. It's something you build, with trust, respect, and small moments that matter.